8 p.m. Eastern on American History TV on C-SPAN 3.
Up next, a conversation on Islamic extremism in the Middle East and around the world. We'll hear from the author of Temptations of Power, Islamists and Liberal Democracy in a New Middle East. The American Enterprise Institute hosted this event.
Good morning, folks. We have a full agenda, so even though not everybody is here, we're just going to allow people to filter in and start our conversation. Good morning, everybody. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies here at AEI. And I'm really delighted that we're doing this conference. The title is Islamic Extremism, Reformism, and the War on Terror, but that really doesn't begin to cover the conversation we're hoping to have. And the provenance of this event is an interesting one. Michael, Rubin, and I were sitting in our office talking about issues and the challenges that we face in foreign policy and domestic policy. And we've both been struck by the scarcity of serious conversation about these issues. The national conversation, even the policy conversations, have been dominated by people on one side like Pamela Geller and on the other side by organizations like CARE, neither of whom I believe represent the mainstream of thought or frankly suggest reasonable or good policy options for how to deal with Islamist extremism in the Middle East and the threat that it poses domestically. There are real issues to talk about here, whether they are over there or they are here within Islam, whether they're U.S. policy. And so that's the conversation that we really hope to have. We're looking to shed light, and that's one of the things that I think that the American Enterprise Institute does best. So I hope I hope that you'll join us in being part of that. I'm not going to introduce the panels. They're roughly divided up. We're going to talk about some of the issues in the region and some of the religious questions in our first panel, and then we're going to talk about policy options in the second panel. But as usual, everybody's going to talk about what they want. You've been here before. The one thing that I want to remind everybody is that while we will have a chance for Q&A, the way that we do our panels now is in a much more informal way. We're not asking everybody to give a presentation up front. This is really meant to be a conversation. And so even though we're seated behind a dais because we can't figure out how to put the chairs in the right place, this is really intended to be more of a lively conversation than it is a series of lectures. I hope that you'll enjoy it, but if you have any comments afterwards, please let me know, and let me turn things over to Michael Rubin. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Danny. I'd like to introduce the first panel, and then we can get right into it. I'm thrilled to be on a panel with three friends. Jennifer, Bryson, and I went to Yale together. We did our PhDs when I was working on Iranian history, and Jennifer was working on Arabic language in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. We continued studying together in Yemen, although Jennifer at a far more advanced level than I was. She has since worked in Guantanamo Bay. And most recently, she's been at the Zephyr Institute, which is right nearby Stanford University. And Jennifer is one of the experts, I think, at issues relating to internal reform, internal debates within Islamism, and has a very, very nuanced view. Next to Jennifer is Shadi Hamid, with whom I oftentimes have to debate on the Diane Rehm show. Fortunately, moderating today, I don't have to worry about Shadi getting the best of me because it often happens. At any rate, Shadi is one of Washington's leading experts on the Muslim Brotherhood and has also thought very, very deeply about issues of reform, what is reform, issues of extremism, what is extremism, and so forth. So I welcome him. And of course, Shadi is at Brookings Institution just up the street and soon to be the American Enterprise Institute's neighbor. And last but not least is my old friend Abbas Kadhim. I met Abbas when we were both lecturing to audiences for the U.S. military, but Abbas is a native of Najaf in Iraq. He's probably one of the best connected Americans to the internal religious debates inside Najaf. At the same time, Abbas has, while he's at a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS, he's also founded in Washington the indispensable Institute for Shiite Studies. And without further ado, what I'm going to do is just open the conversation to my panelists with a very basic question. We often talk about how Islam needs a reform, but what exactly is a reform in the what is reformism in the Islamic context?
I'd like to start by rejecting the concept of reform. I don't find it helpful. I find language of revival, renewal, and development more helpful. And let's look just very recently at the Chattanooga shooter. His problem was that he was disconnected from the very rich and complex traditions of Islam.
So, it's up here. Okay, great. So, I don't like a different word. So you don't like reform. I don't like reformation. And I feel like this word, we've been hearing more and more of it. And there's a New York Times bestseller that has that word prominently in the subtitle, A.N. Hersey Ali's new book. So, I mean, part of the problem there is this idea that we can apply concepts that were specific to Christianity and its evolution to a very different religion, Islam. And this idea that we almost assume, like there's this liberal determinism that all societies, cultures, and peoples will ultimately end up at the same endpoint, the end of history, if you will. It's just a matter of how long it takes to get there and what happens along the way. I mean, I find this idea a little bit, you know, in a way it's sort of paternalistic and patronizing. I mean, why exactly should Islam be like Christianity? Why should Muslims necessarily? And, you know, there was that big debate that I'm sure a lot of you saw with Bill Maher and Ben Affleck. And, you know, I think a lot of us were, or maybe not, I don't know, but a lot of us were cheering on Ben Affleck. But actually, when you looked at the substance of what he was saying, it was kind of problematic, even though that might have been our kind of instinctual feel to say, oh, good. He was essentially saying that we all want the same things, that Muslims want to eat sandwiches too. And he actually said that, eating sandwiches, as if, and you know, we all want to raise kids and have good jobs and all of that, which is all fine, but you can want to eat a sandwich but still believe that Islamic law should be central in public life. You can want to eat sandwiches and believe that the hudud punishment should be implemented. And that's where I think it becomes challenging. But anyway, the point there is that it may be that Islam, and I'll just put this out there and we can get back to it, what if Islam is uniquely resistant to secularization? Then what?
I'm just going to push back on one question, actually ask you for clarification. When you say hudud punishments, I think everyone on the panel knows what they are, but for the wider audience.
So the hudud punishments would include stoning adulterers, cutting off the hands of thieves, various punishments for alcohol consumption, the death penalty for apostasy.
Okay, I'm actually going to push back on something Jennifer said, if I may, or actually try to extrapolate a little bit more. When you talk about how it's necessary not to necessarily have a reform, but a reconnection with the rich theology and some of the theological debates within the Islamic context, the question is, given in the late 20th century, the distortion that's come from some of the funding of radicalism from, for example, some of the Persian Gulf Emirates, or we could say from the Islamic Republic of Iran as well, in the more Shia context, how do you actually go about reviving some of the other strains of debate which might not be as well resourced? And just for the audience, if you could identify what you think theologically those strains are.
So, small disagreement I have with Shadi on this. Both touch on an issue that I think is really important, and this is the issue of religious freedom, including religious freedom for Muslims in Muslim-majority society. One thing with these hudud punishments, it is debated whether or not death for apostasy is a HUD punishment. And so that debate is ongoing, and there's a lot of rich substance in it. And for this distortion that we see today, it's one reason that in my own research I became so interested in the question of Muslim support for religious freedom, including in Muslim-majority societies, is because there are a lot of constructive voices out there, but they're often crushed by authoritarian regimes, modern social pressures. And so I think one of the most important things is going to be reducing the barriers that the constructive voices face, such as censorship and lack of funding. And as for specifically which one in details, I'm going to pass on that for now because it's almost too big a question, but that'll at least start it off.
We'll come back to that. This is actually a question that I'm going to ask to Abbas, because maybe we could say that we have a sectarian divide going down the middle of this table, simply because while I'm not Muslim, my background, my PhD is in Iranian history, and so I've spent much more of my time in the Shiite world. So when it comes to some of the sectarian differences about which we hear so much today, I remember that while Shiites might only be 10 or 15% of the Muslim population worldwide, between the Mediterranean through Iran, it's about a 50-50 split, which means there's a sense that absolutely everything is in play. When it comes to Shiism and the issue of extremism, are there major differences? And actually, I'll ask Abbas to go first, but this is for the panel, between how internally Sunnis and Shiites deal with extremism, or, for lack of a better word, reform or revival within their own communities.
Well, thank you. We will be happy to give you an honorary Shia citizenship, so that's no problem there. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to American Enterprise for putting together this timely and important panel. Glad to be with this distinguished group of scholars. Let me weave that into addressing your first question, because I think it's important, and give it a little bit of a different slant. I have no problem with the word reformation or a reform, as long as we know reform of what and how. I think if we distinguish between these two concepts, that Islam as a religion and then what Muslims did as a historical series of events, we can talk, and we legitimately should talk, about reforming the Muslim experience over 1400 years, because what we don't really have in the original source of Qur'an, of Islam, the Qur'an that is, and the authentic hadith as we can authenticate it, it is not specific what we do about the state. A lot of the hudud, etc., have been developed later, and we can't talk about the specifics. So it is a Muslim experience, and reform can always be going back to the roots of Islam, and then trying to derive from those roots what works for this time and this age, just like the Muslims throughout the centuries have gone, some of them, to the roots and then developed what was working for them in their time and in their place. So we can talk about reform, and it's a legitimate question. In terms of your latter question, and extremism, whether it's in Shia or in non-Shia, I don't like to use the word Sunni. When I taught, I said, there is such a thing as Sunni. We have 4 schools of theology and 4 schools of jurisprudence. Everyone says we got it right and the others are wrong. So basically the 4 other schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, extremism is extremism everywhere, and it is as problematic. I wouldn't say a Shia extremist is better than a Sunni or a non-Shia extremist, or the other way around. But also they are coming from the same source. People do interpret their sources and their original sources of the religion. Some of them interpret them in a more friendly way, and others have or take a little more restrictive point of view. But extremists in both sides, or in all sides, claim an illegitimate monopoly over the truth and oppress others into accepting their opinions, or else.
Well, actually, before I turn the floor over to Hadi and Jennifer on this, I actually just want to push forward. What I was trying to get at was this notion that within Shiism, of course, one follows a source of emulation, a marja at-taqlid, and so there's constant debate as one follows traditionally and predominantly, although not always, as we've discussed on previous panels, living sources of emulation. And so that means the debate continues dynamically, although perhaps then, and anyone who's gone to Najaf or Qom or Karbala has seen the various debates that occur, maybe at a micro level among the various ayatollahs. There sometimes seems that within the Sunni world, and I'll throw this to Jennifer and to Shadi, that this idea of an ongoing debate is constrained by the notion that centuries ago a consensus has been achieved, a consensus which can no longer be challenged. Is that a factor, or is it not a factor? Abbas first, and then I'll...
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are differences, and I would even go as far as saying there are differences among the four schools that we call the Sunni schools. Sometimes in certain schools of Islam, certain dead people have an omnipresent authority. Ibn Taymiyyah for the Hanbalis, it is very hard to come against a ruling that he has made in the 13th century, that is, and AD. And that is something that is with us, and that's why we see it is very hard to loosen oneself from the grip of the authority of certain people like Ibn Taymiyyah. But if you go in other schools or in other places, Al-Azhar does come up with new rulings all the time, and Hanafism and Shafi'ism, and also in the Maliki school, there are a lot of them. But you are right on one thing, right on the spot, is that the Shia have gone with the idea of the ijtihad much more than their counterparts, and that gave them a lot of flexibility to fit in the time and the circumstance. And we see even among Shia, different times have led to different rulings, as we can see from Khou'i to Sistani, or before that from Hakim to Khou'i, or even earlier from 1920 scholars such as Al-Ha'iri and Sheikh al-Sharia al-Isfahani, to their followers. Na'ini, the great constitutionalist who came up with one of the most important books about constitutionalism in Islam. So you have that, and there I would agree with you totally, yes.
Just one two-finger. Can you define for the audience ijtihad, the term that you...
Ijtihad, basically, it's one of the other sort of disagreed upon concepts. In the etymology of it in Arabic, ijtihad means giving one's opinion or giving one's side of a certain argument. But ijtihad as a term in Shia jurisprudence means exerting one's effort to deduce or deduct a ruling from the original sources of Islam, the Qur'an, the Sunnah of the Prophet, the tradition of the Prophet, or the other sources such as reason or the consensus of scholars when it existed.
Okay, Shadi?
Yeah, so I agree with Abbas that so among conservative Muslims and even among Islamists, there's wide diversity of interpretation, and that's in part because Islamist movements, contrary to popular perception, have largely been non-clerical movements. So we're talking about engineers, doctors, and lawyers trying to take pre-modern concepts and applying them to a very different modern context. So obviously you're going to have a lot of diversity. But I guess what I'm saying is there can be disagreement about the specific implementation of Sharia law, but there does seem to be... But I would kind of go back a little bit further and say, if we look at the founding moment of Islam, and Muslims aren't bound to their founding moment, but Muslims can't fully escape their founding moment either. Founding moments matter. And the fact that Prophet Muhammad was not just a prophet or a theologian, but also a politician, a warrior, a merchant, and perhaps most importantly, a head of state, a small kind of mini-state, that has real implications, even 14 centuries later, because now if you have a secular reformist type in the Arab world, and he or she is making the case, separation of religion from politics, privatization of religion, that person has to go up against the prophetic model. Now, there are ways to do that, but they're challenging, and it's unlikely to get a critical mass of support in the Muslim world because it really involves challenging hermeneutical kind of arguments. So that's where I think the prophetic model, which is something that even not particularly religious Muslims really value and take seriously, that matters. And I would just mention one more thing. The Muslim relationship to the text is quite different than Christianity. So there is no equivalent to Quranic inerrancy in Christianity. So even if you talk to right-wing evangelicals, they don't believe that, they will say that the Bible is the Word of God, but they would not say that the Bible is God's actual speech. And this might not sound like an important distinction, but it is absolutely critical in my view. Even if you're a lax Muslim, it's a creedal requirement to believe that the Quran is not just the word of God, not just inspired by God, but God's actual speech. What that means in practice is that every single letter and word is not mediated, it didn't go through anyone else, it is God's speech. So the fact that even a lax Muslim has a more intense commitment to the text theoretically than a right-wing evangelical does to the Bible, we can debate what the implications of that are, but that's something we have to keep in mind. And just one more thing on this Reformation issue, I think we've had a Reformation of sorts. In the late 19th, early 20th century, there was the Islamic modernist movement led by Abdou and Afghani, and pretty much which then led into what we today call mainstream Islamism, so the Brotherhood school of thought. And if I had to define Islamism, mainstream Islamism, not jihadism or Islamist extremism, in one sentence, I would sort of phrase it like this. An attempt to reconcile pre-modern Islamic law with the modern nation state. And if you look at what the Brotherhood has been trying to do for decades, that's pretty much what their project is. And so with that, depending on your view of the Brotherhood, that could mean, be careful what you wish for. Reform and Reformation can lead to ascendant conservative forces. Some people would say that even Salafis are an example of the Islamic Reformation. My friend Graham Wood, who wrote the Great Atlantic article, we were on a panel recently, and he said ISIS is an example of the Islamic Reformation.
Jennifer?
I want to touch quickly on Abbas's phrase, illegitimate monopoly. I find this really helpful when we look at, and Shadi commented on the diversity of different types of extremist movements, even within Islam. I think this phrase of illegitimate monopoly is precisely what these individual movements want to claim. As for Reformation, I agree actually with your latter comment about how some would say, Islam's initial movement towards effort of a reformation of sorts within the Sunni tradition, I see coming more with the Salafis, who looked at the traditions as sort of barnacles stuck on a ship that need to be removed and wanted to reject that, and then also had a very narrow view of what it means to go back to original sources and what's possible from those.
Okay, I mean, just an explanation to the audience. We may appear that we are delving into the weeds, but that's only because the second panel, which is going to be led by Danielle Pletka, is going to look at the greater macro issues of how this fits into United States policy and broader policy within the Islamic world. That said, what I want to do is pick up on something which Abbas said almost in an offhanded way when you talked about, you differentiated authentic hadith. And this reminds me of some of the work I've done with, for example, the FBI, in which I oftentimes hear, and I've heard this from other Islamic scholars as well, about the problems growing in the region from inauthentic hadith. Now, a hadith, of course, is an example saying tradition of the Prophet Mohammed. It's an important source of theology beyond the text of the Qur'an itself. But the question I have, and this also builds on what Shadi said when you made the excellent observation that oftentimes what we have with these modern, if you will, more extremist movements are movements of engineers, of doctors, of other professionals, rather than movements which are necessarily being led by theologians. So when you have a situation like this, maybe in your various areas of expertise, and within the greater Middle East and Islamic world, you all have different areas of expertise. I'd like you to address any examples or problems you see from inauthentic teachings percolating to the top, and speculate on how within the Islamic world you can counteract these, or perhaps stepping on the toes of the second panel, how within the policy world you can you can contradict these. Can I go to you first, Jennifer?
Okay, one specific example comes to mind that I've been looking at in a lot more detail is so these hadith are sayings and actions attributed to Muhammad. And with this issue that earlier about whether or not death for apostasy is a mandatory punishment, this does not come from the Qur'an, but rather from a saying attributed to Mohammed, a hadith. And I think also here we need to touch on the modern media environment of 140 characters. So we often, at least those of us who are involved full-time in Islamic studies, will see, in social media, both in non-Muslims who are very involved in these anti-Muslim movements, as well as some of the extremists, this little phrase, Mohammed said, he who changes his religion, kill him. Well, that fits into 140 characters, and so that gets shared around. But that is embedded within a saying itself that has all these traditions of who narrated it, who said this, and this is very, very important for Muslims themselves, and this is where these questions of authenticity come from. And that saying of Muhammad has in its chain of transmission somebody named Ikrimah, who was known as a liar. And so there are major scholars throughout Islam who won't accept any traditions that were narrated by Ikrimah. And now it gets into far, far, far more detail. And you're probably starting to get bored. And those who are thriving on the quick social media get bored. And that's where we then lose connection to these discussions going on that are challenging acceptance of that hadith. And they're challenging it based on internal traditions to Islam, but these get into long, detailed conversations by the scholars and the theologians, which is very different from the way political activists coming from an engineering or medical background will approach the texts.
Shadi or Abbas?
Go ahead. So I would just offer a note of caution. I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves this question of, does belief precede action, or is it the other way around? So sometimes we just assume, so doctrine says something, and therefore that explains why a certain Islamist group takes a certain political action. But oftentimes in practice, it's the reverse. And you especially see this with mainstream Islamist movements, the Brotherhood or Nahda or the PJD. They'll do something out of...
Can you define PJD just for
the Justice and Development Party. It's the main Islamist party in Morocco now, and is actually part of a coalition government. So they will feel forced to do something. So political necessity will push them in a certain direction, but they won't have thought it out theologically. But then, because they've done it, they have to justify it to their followers and tell them that this is Islamically authentic. So they retroactively go and try to figure out some way to justify things that they probably wouldn't have justified 10 or 15 years ago. And Islamist movements over time, we don't have to like them, but I think we have to acknowledge that they have changed on a number of key issues: attitude towards democracy, women's rights. They don't believe in gender equality, but from where they were in the 60s to where they are now, there has been a shift. But all these things, I would argue, were driven primarily by political context and not theology, no considered discussion of theology. So does it really matter what certain hadiths say? Yes, it matters, but we can debate how much it matters, because if you want to find something in the Islamic tradition to justify whatever you're doing, you probably will be able to find it somewhere, because it's such a diverse, rich tradition.
Could I just jump in to respond quickly, and then we'd love to hear from Abbas. Shadi makes a vitally important point that it's often political agendas and power seeking that are driving actions, and then digging, a little bit shallowly through the tradition to try to justify them. But this question of, so then, does Islamic theology matter, I think is really important. And I just had a blog post that I put up at Arc of the Universe, a University of Notre Dame blog, of a lecture by Aurangzeb Hanif from Pakistan, who gave a terrific talk on this question of, does Islamic theology matter if what is going on is fundamentally political? And one of the key points he makes, he feels as a Muslim, he's looking at this Sunni perspective, that the religious, public religious discussions have become so distorted that he feels that this engagement at the theological level does matter, even if that itself is not a primary driver.
Well, I'm just going to give it a little bit of nuance here. Back to your question of authenticity, and since I normally go deeper into that when I teach, but today when I spoke about it, it came as a fit in the conversation. Authenticity here, there are two kinds of issues with the hermeneutics of the original sources of Islam. The Qur'an, as Shadi exactly said, Muslims at least, believe that this is the exact word of God. It has not been changed by as little as a comma since the days of Prophet Mohammed. That still does not mean we are immune from error when we rely on the Qur'an, because there will be the issue of interpretation. We deal with words that are that have been in currency 1400 years ago. Yes, it is the same language, but if you want to just bring it home, just imagine how different the meaning of the word arms in the U.S. today from the days of Madison and Jefferson. In the Second Amendment, are we talking about the thing that Madison needed 5 minutes to load, or the thing that you can mow down 200 people in a matter of seconds? We don't know really what Madison would do if he saw the AK-47. So what do we do here? We go with our own best efforts to imagine what he would do. And there are good arguments on both sides. In Islam, the same thing. Yes, the Qur'an is the word of God in the mind of a Muslim, but the meaning of each word in the Qur'an is in dispute among the Muslims today as to what they meant 1400 years ago. When it comes to the hadith, that is, when we talk about the hadith, actually it's not just the statements of the Prophet. The source of legislation in Islam are the statements, the acts, and the consent of the Prophet. And I don't want to go deeper into that, but when you go to the acts and consent, you even become murkier in your interpretation of what those meant. But if we stick to the hadith as in general, the authenticity is a very important issue to think about. Unlike the Qur'an, which was recorded in the time of the Prophet, the hadith was recorded 200 years or so after his death. So and so told me, so and so told him, so and so told him, so and so told him, until you get 200 years later, and the Prophet said. How many of you can reproduce what we said in the last 15 minutes? Imagine, 6, 7, 8 people in the chain of transmission that will get you exactly. If we are differing on the meaning of an exact word, what will happen in those 200 years? So that is one thing. The other part of it, or the other layer of it, is that it is not always this hadith or the Quran is being used honestly. Let's remember that those groups, whether they are terrorist groups or their ideologues, they are not using these in an honest way to get the right verdict. But most of the time, these are used and cited to advance a certain agenda. Muslims have lied and attributed things to the Prophet for 1400 years, and there are stories after stories about what people did. So in a matter of hadiths that trickle down, and again, I think it wasn't addressed, the part of your question, what kind of hadith that will come in? Take the hadith of, for example, this about the 70 virgins. It is not in any one of these 6 hadith books that are considered authentic. It is coming from out of that, and then even if you were to think where it is used to help or to sort of lure those people who are, fit the profile. Who is the guy who will be a suicide bomber? Look at their profile. Are these people who are likely to go and study the 6 hadith books and see which hadith is right and which not, and what it means? Much less to say about, as one of our colleagues used to say, the hadith should be rejected on the grounds of practicality. Even in paradise, you will not be able to find 70 virgins. So it's just an issue that you have to really deal with, but it is used to manipulate certain people, and that is what you have. Between the Shia and Sunnis, the Shia don't even have a book that they can call authentic, sahih. and that is easy. Yes, they do consider certain hadith sahih, but even for certain hadiths that have been used as sahih for 1400 years or 1200 years or 1000 years, you've seen recent scholars who came out and said these are not really sahih. Sayyid Khou'i, for example, one of the greatest hadith scholars who passed away in 1992, he came out and rejected certain hadiths that have been used by the greatest scholars of Islam before, hadiths attributed to the Imams or to the Prophet. So there is always that revision. This word sahih, and especially for Bukhari, kind of ties the hands of certain Muslims in the non-Shia world when they want to come against it. Al-Bukhari is one of the compilers of the hadith books. He, again, around 200 years after the Prophet's death, came and worked from the age 16, actually about 16 years he was working on that hadith compilation. He traveled around the Muslim world and then put together what he considered to be the exact authentic hadith books, several thousand hadiths that are put in his book Al-Jami' As-Sahih. He called it Sahih, and people now in Muslim world, in the what we call loosely the Sunni world, say this is the most authentic book after the Qur'an. So going against any hadith of this in Bukhari, he's a man from Bukhara, basically. That's why they call him Bukhari. And Bukhara is in today's Uzbekistan, isn't it, I think? Yes. And basically, that is the most authentic, according to Sunni Muslims, most authentic hadith. And of course, there is Muslim, his companion and contemporary, who came and followed his footsteps, and he came up with another book. Sometimes they agree on certain hadiths, sometimes one of them has one and the other doesn't. But these are the two most important. But Bukhari, by far, is the canonical collection of prophetic hadith that is being followed.
If I could just offer a nod of segue toward the next panel and look at all this discussion here about how complicated making sense of even one individual hadith is, and these traditions that Abbas and Shadi have talked about, I see this. One of the things that needs to be done is there has to be room for this complexity. And two mistakes that I see being made. One is by governments with Muslim majority populations, which are trying to respond to violent extremism by having the government decide what good Islam is, and having this very narrow, watered-down, simplistic version that is government approved for the textbooks and that crushes discussion. This is foreign to Islam. The other mistake, I've seen this in some European governments. Some Austrian members of parliament wanted Muslims in Austria to write down, basically in a book, what the Quran means. And they said, well, you have to tell us what it means, and you have to have then a statement that all Muslims in Austria are going to agree on. And I just saw a Muslim in the audience laugh at this, which is appropriate. This is looking at Islam through a lens of Christian traditions, where in the Catholic and Orthodox Christian traditions, you had councils that had creeds and came upon an agreement. By contrast, it is in the nature of Islam that there's going to be this ongoing discussion, and you're not going to be able to fit it into a textbook for 6-year-olds approved by the government and close the discussion. So I think we've got to keep space open for the discussion to keep going.
So as I've been thinking about some of these issues, listening to my colleagues, I think there's one area where religion plays an undeniable role, and it's a little bit more basic than the specifics about hadith. So I've spent a lot of time with Islamist activists, particularly Muslim Brotherhood members and leaders, and when you get to know these guys, you're probably going to at some point hear their conversion story, if you will, how they decided to join the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, we probably have our preconceived notions about why people join, but one thing that struck me is that the more I got to know them, I kept on hearing certain things, where there was this one Brotherhood member who I remember said to me that he joined the Brotherhood because he wants to get into heaven. It's that simple for him. It's not about political power, elections, anything like that. He believes that joining an organization with a structured curriculum and a hierarchical leadership structure will help push him to become a better Muslim. And I feel like for those of us, you know, secular Westerners, we have trouble understanding this basic inspiration, and we try to kind of parse their words. Well, he doesn't really mean that. There's got to be something more material and tangible that's driving him. Like maybe he's poor or economically, you know, he's underemployed. I feel like we have to take these things more seriously because that's what they believe. So even if somehow they have false consciousness about what they actually believe, and they're probably the better judges of what they believe, but even if they have false consciousness of some sort, they believe that this is what is driving them. And in some ways, it's actually the most rational explanation for joining a group like the Muslim Brotherhood. What is more important than eternal salvation? I mean, when you think about it, that's pretty much the most important thing, right? That's pretty rational.
I'm actually going to, just in the next 5 minutes, I have one other question that delves a little bit into the weeds with regard to interpretation. And then I'm going to open the panel to questions from the floor before we move on to our next panel. But there's actually two issues which I want to touch upon. One is this issue which is oftentimes cited to explain radicalism, and that's the issue of abrogation. And what that means is that when you have two verses of the Qur'an which seemingly contradict each other, that which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad last automatically trumps that which came earlier. And as Shadi had said, I mean, Muhammad was not only the prophet of a great religion, but he was also a statesman, and it was towards the end of his life that the state really started to consolidate. And therefore, some of these later verses tend to be a little bit more stricter or hardline in their interpretation, if you will. So how does the issue of abrogation, number one, fit in? And the second question I want to throw open to the panel. I had a relatively secular upbringing. I went to a Quaker school, and when I would read Shakespeare, for example, in junior high school, I didn't really know the Bible that well. I didn't know a lot of the biblical allusions, and therefore I was reliant on the facing page of the Shakespeare to explain what some of the metaphors and such were. Now, I think it was Khalil Muhammad over in the University of California system who had argued that, of course, during the rise of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula, Mecca itself, the world in which Muhammad lived was an incredibly diverse world. Mecca was a trading city. Muhammad was a merchant, and so had interacted with Jews, had interacted with Christians. If we want to look more broadly, people also understood a great deal of Zoroastrianism. This came out in Leor Halevi's book, a Vanderbilt University professor, on Muhammad's grave. Now, the question I have is, given how much was understood, and I'm borrowing this from Khalil Muhammad's talks, given how much was understood by early Muslims about Christianity and Judaism, and frankly how little is understood about Christianity and Judaism by many contemporary Muslims today in places like Saudi Arabia, what is lost in the interpretation that simply is like me trying to read Shakespeare without a biblical education? So those are two questions, abrogation and the impact of other religions in interpretation. Then we'll throw the panel open to questions.
I will address the abrogation and let my colleagues elaborate on the other part of your question, so we will divide the work. Abrogation here is, you talked about two rulings. One comes later than the first, or the second comes later, and then you get a modification of the verdict. Let me give you an example that brings it to home. You know, in the U.S., for example, when it comes to segregation and desegregation of schools, you know, you have in the late 1800s, 1890s, a case by the Supreme Court was called Plessy versus Ferguson that says, yeah, you keep the kids separate but give them equal facilities. Then that was the law for years and years until 1954, and you come with Brown versus the Board of Education in Kansas, and then this case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, equal by definition or inherently is, I mean, separate is not equal inherently. So now you have the law that says you desegregate, and then you get to the implementation of it as we know it from history in the Eisenhower days. Same thing here in Islam. There are two kinds of murky issues when you talk about abrogation. First, we talk about Qur'an abrogating Qur'an. So in other words, in the early days of Islam, there were certain, or the Prophet's life, there were certain issues that were addressed in different way than later. A concrete example is the consumption of alcohol. There is a verse that says, do not pray while drunk. So simply, in order to be able to know what you do. So yeah, you get to, I mean, there's fine print because you pray all the time, so you don't get time to be drunk, but still, even if you manage to squeeze in a glass or two, then that's fine. That's early because you talk about people in the Arabian Peninsula at the time where their only means of entertainment was drinking. So if you come to them and there is a new religion and give up this, give up that, etc., and then you give up alcohol, they say, go. I'm not going to be part of Islam, so give them that. Later on, when there was a lot of investment, there was a state that could enforce that rule, said don't drink, period. Now the second one abrogated the first. Now and that's what they call partial abrogation, but that's a nuance. But anyway, the earlier one continued to be in existence in the Quran, because if somebody who prays, you know, he can't drink and pray. Now, the other problematic part that we probably is more relevant to our panel is when there is this school that says the hadith of the Prophet can abrogate the Quran. Now, the Quran is authentic. That is abrogating another piece of the authentic scripture. You can deal with it, even though we don't know really for sure which verse came before the other. You read Noldika and you see this is a mess here, which, you know, when you look at the chronological, but at least Quran abrogating Quran. But when you get to a school that says the hadith can abrogate the Quran, then we go back to what Jennifer was talking about in terms of the hadith that is attributed to the Prophet saying, whoever abandons his religion, kill him. Now, this is a hadith that is attributed to the Prophet, but it goes exactly against a verse after another in the Quran. That the Quran says, whoever wants to believe, let him believe. Whoever wants to disbelieve, let him disbelieve. Another verse, it says, he who believes, then goes into disbelief, then believes again, then goes into disbelief, and then increases his disbelief. So there is a process of someone who is defying the belief time and again, and then you know, if there is a killing, he would not have the chance to do all of these things. In the Quran, which gave certain hudud, these punishments, to much lighter issues, less than the death penalty, you know, and it addresses abandoning religion, apostasy, but it doesn't give punishment. The only punishment is cited in the Quran is in the hereafter. So that is another indication. Well, if the Quran is silent on it, how can you do it? There is also the most clear one, La ikraha fi din. There should be no compulsion in matters of religion. Again, 6, 7, 8 verses you can cite that say no punishment, and then one hadith that you find it with a lot of you know, grains of salt. You have to take it with, and Muslims do follow it in order to kill someone where the Quran does not. So abrogation of hadith or the Quran by the hadith is or has been the most problematic practice by Muslim ideologues and Muslim states, frankly, because that's how to get rid of your opponents. And what a better way than to say the Prophet said do it and you do it.
Very briefly to Shadi and Jennifer, and then we'll have a few moments for questions.
Just one thing. There was a Sudanese scholar, Mahmoud Mohamed Taha. He was executed by the Jafar Namiri regime in the 80s. So he wrote a book called The Second Message of Islam, where he essentially makes a distinction between the Meccan verses and the Medina verses. And his argument is essentially that the verses that were revealed in Mecca are the kind of eternal principles of Islam. The verses that were revealed in Medina are actually examples of how to apply those eternal principles to the specific historical and political context of Medina, 7th century. And I think that raises a very, interesting question of historical context. So Muslims all agree that it's the word of God, but then you get into this issue. Let's hypothesize, what if a divine message like the Qur'an was revealed in modern-day New York City to someone like Mohammed, whatever the New York modern equivalent of Prophet Muhammad is, right? Presumably, some of the things would be different. And just with that kind of thought experiment, we know that historical context really matters. So, for example, when it comes to gay rights, presumably anything revealed today in New York would have a little bit of a different perspective, a more tolerant one. Saying that women receive half of the inheritance of men. No one would take the divine message seriously in the US or Europe or in a lot of other places in the world if that was in the text. They'd say this doesn't really relate to our modern context. So that's one way of looking at this issue of context.
Jennifer?
Just briefly on this question of abrogation, what I think we need to look at is the internal discussions that Muslims themselves are having, because it raises flags for me when the most frequent place that I see this question of abrogation being raised, in which later verses of the Quran or perhaps even Hadith then would make other verses of the Quran illegitimate. I see it raised most often by non-Muslims who are very attached to a narrative of, well, Islam is inherently violent, C. Well, if they're the only ones really raising this again and again and again, that should put up some flags for us. I relate that, for example, to this concept of taqiyya, which is raised often by those who say you can never trust a Muslim because this term means that, well, it's okay to lie sometimes. Muslim friend said to me, he said, how can I be doing something I've never heard of? If these conversations aren't important internally to Muslims themselves, we need to look at that. And real quick, I think you raise a great point about how familiarity with Jewish and Christian traditions was important and common historically, and is astonishingly absent today. I think that there is room to reopen that.
Let me just open the floor to a very few questions. Again, you can ask as many questions as you want, but we're only going to answer the first one. And second of all, everyone in Washington has an affiliation, so say your name and where you're from. And wait for the microphone. Wait for the microphone. And then after that, we're going to go to Hedia, and then we'll probably turn over to the next panel.
Mustafa Gürbüz from Rethink Institute. Isn't it to think about the prophetic model as the head of state is a modern imagination?
Very good question. Is it a modern imagination to think about the prophetic model as a head of state?
Should I also tell another sentence to explain what I meant?
Sure.
So, if we look at the modern construction of the self, going back to the roots, isn't it to think that this is fundamentalism, which could be applied to other contexts, what we call fundamentalism in various forms, either religious or non-religious? So why Islam should be exceptional in thinking and explaining complex human behavior?
Okay. So he obviously wasn't a head of a state in the modern sense of the word state, but he was the head of a political community, one that had a somewhat distinct geographical location. So we can call it a variety of different things, but I think the point still holds that he was the head of whatever that thing is, whether state, community, ummah, and so on.
I have to admit that when Shadi used the phrase head of state, I sort of thought, oh, no, I disagree. I think it is helpful to realize that the nation state today is a different type of structure, and the head of a nation state today has powers that are fundamentally different. And this is something that some Muslims themselves have raised, such as Abdullahi Naim, who has this interesting argument where he feels that for him as a Muslim to follow Sharia authentically, It needs to be in an environment where the state is neutral and not involved, because the powers of the modern nation state are so foreign to the traditions of Islam. And so he says, for him to be following by choice as a believer, it needs to be a personal choice and not imposed by force of this new thing we have today of nation state. So I look at Mohamed more as a community leader, although I recognize what Shadi said. It was a political community of sorts.
Well, if I may, it's a very important debate and distinction, simply because if you read Ayatollah Khomeini's works, he legitimizes his claim to be to the structure of the Islamic Republic of Iran based on his reading of the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet Muhammad's involvement in politics. And likewise, we could say the same thing. Whether it's legitimate or not is a question for the second panel, but the issue of the Islamic State and the self-declared caliphate, which Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has put forward, has raised these debates to the forefront again.
Just if I may add one thing. I would say, yes, the state that the Prophet presided over was not recognized by UN Security Council, but basically, let's look at how he went about it. First, even though he was bound by the message that he said it came from God, he was very pragmatic, seeing that Medina had a community of Jews and Muslims, and he drafted what scholars call the Constitution of Medina, about 40-some articles that regulated the relation between Jews and Muslims within Medina in a secular way, I would say, not religious way. He mobilized armies. He conducted business with foreign or sort of other entities. He even regulated the relation of people coming to Medina or leaving, in other words, refugees, etc., who would run away. He applied laws. He had punishments. He organized the society. So there is all of that within the time frame of the 7th century. I would say, yes, you can call it a state, but yeah, of course, if you compare it with Luxembourg today, that would not be a state. I agree.
Very quickly, Hedia, and then we'll go on to the next panel. Can you just please wait for the microphone?
Hedi Amiramati, president of Word. Jennifer, you made a great point about the oversimplification of Islam for the Islamists, the 140 characters or less. In light of that, and then in response that there's this rich tradition in Islam and that we need access to it and removing the obstacles to access to it. So do you, and I ask this question to all of you, do you really think then that mainstream Muslims, traditional Muslims, will be able to ever launch a successful campaign against Islamist extremism if we are not able to overly simplify traditional mainstream Islam?
It's a great question.
Yes, it is a good question. I think, so for example, I work together with a group of Muslims now on a project called IslamandReligiousFreedom.org. And one of the things that we're looking for ways to do is to try to find bridges between the complex analyses, for example, of these hadith to the 140 character versions. And we're finding that one of the most important things we have to do is devote a long-term period of time, because our engagement at the 140 character level is drop, 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 drop. And it takes a lot of those drops to keep the conversation going and keep others engaged and be able to touch on the different aspects. But this bridge between a modern media world that wants quick, simple answer and the reality of this complexity is very, very tough. And my Twitter account, somebody just asked me to...
That's just for...
Oh, I'm sorry. I just got this note. Okay. Anyways, so it's going to be hard, but it's not impossible. But it's going to take time.
I was going to just conclude. very cleverly by saying we were talking about Twitter, and since everyone on this panel has so much expertise, I thought that as we conclude and as we welcome the next panel, I would ask each of you, or I would tell each of you, provide your Twitter handle. So it's at Dr. Abbas Kadhim, Kadhim. Shadi?
At Shadi Hamid, so my name.
At Bryson JS. That's J as in Juliet, S as in Sierra.
And I'm M. Rubin, 1971, but it's always important, it's crucial indeed, to follow at AEI as well. And with that, I want to thank our panelists. It was a truly fascinating panel.
Thanks so much for coming.
I feel like there should be a really good play called Waiting for Mohamed. Thank you, everybody. That was really a marvelous panel, and I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. We're really going to turn now to a little bit more of a, for lack of a better word, a practical conversation about what to do. I think we understand in depth some of the challenges that face us, and the fact that this is not a simple issue where we can suddenly embrace a reformist and expect that in 10 years reform will have happened. Part of the challenge I think that we face, and one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation, and I'm so glad to be joined by such a distinguished panel to discuss this, is that our national conversation really has been dominated on the one side by sort of political correctness. Successive presidents, Republican, Democratic, who like to stand up and say, this is not Islam, as if somehow they are in a position to dictate what Islam is, whether they're right or wrong. And the Islamic State is neither. Well, I actually think, and the evidence suggests that in fact the Islamic State is both. It may not be the Islam that should be, but it is in fact certainly a form of Islam. And then on the other side, bigotry. All Muslims are terrorists. This has sort of become the tenor of the public conversation, rather than an intelligent debate about what it is that we can do. So today I'm joined by three marvelous people: Zainab, al-Suwaij, who is the co-founder of the American Islamic Congress, and their full bios are online should anybody want it. Ambassador Husain Haqqani, who is the former Pakistani ambassador to the United States, a scholar at the Hudson Institute, and I never remember the name of the publication. I'm looking it up, and editor of current trends in Islamist ideology, and Mohamed Younis, who is an expert on Islam and the issues that we're going to be talking about for the Gallup organization, and particularly a specialist on questions of youth unemployment in the Middle East. So let's start sort of super generally. Is this at heart, this problem of Islamist extremism, something that the United States can try to contend with as a matter of policy? Are there policy answers? You start.
Thank you very much, Danny. I think this question is the President recently have mentioned, and he said we are not in a war with Islam. And that certainly came through, and we all agree with that. But I don't understand why he did not make the distinction between Islam as a religion and Islam, the ideologically driven by Islamists and extremists. I think there is a big difference between the two, and I think we should be clear when we address this issue, especially right now, and we see the rise of radical extremism, not only in the Middle East and the Muslim world, but also here, attaching us here in the United States. I think we are in a very critical period of time, and we need to move forward in addressing these issues, addressing it in a very wise way, but also firm and strong.
Okay, so and I want everybody else to answer this question as well. But as you answer it, consider this. Okay, fine. Let's embrace the idea that we should have a war on Islamist extremists of the ISIS variety, not a war with Islam, the religion, or Muslims in general. What does that war look like? What are the component parts of it? If you want to punt it over to Husain, I'll come back to you afterwards.
I'm happy to sort of take over from Zainab. It's always a pleasure. Let me just begin by saying that I was here for the last panel, and I was quite sort of, Shadi spoke of Islam's foundational moment. The truth is that Islam's foundational moment actually continued well into the next 3-4 centuries. For example, Prophet Mohamed was not the founder of the caliphate. His successors were. Similarly, there were other debates. And 1.2 billion people simply cannot have, they can say they have one faith, and they can all think they belong to one community, but it's not one faith, it's multiple dimensions. I mean, look at the Christianity in the United States, from Quakerism to evangelical Christianity. They all are Christians, and then there are Mormons, whom some Christians may have different views of, but they consider themselves Christian. So Islam is the same. It has many, many dimensions. And basically what we are dealing with is the problem of those who are engaged in war. And so you cannot fight a war without recognizing that these people are your enemies. And so this attempt to try and assuage Muslim feelings, and then Muslims, and I speak here as somebody who has been born in the faith community, Muslims trying to be apologetic and saying, don't criticize our religion. Well, nobody's criticizing your religion as long as that religion is connected to your desire for purity and piety. It's about people being beheaded, which is unacceptable to modern civilization that people are complaining and commenting about. So all these parsing of theological arguments in American universities is not going to help, with all due respect. I mean, they can understand, but Islamic history is complex. In the 8th and 10th century, there were the Mutazilites, people who wanted more reason in religion. And the reason why they became weak, although they survived well into the 15th century, small groups, they became weak was because the caliph decided to use the force of the state on one side and the other. So what we have seen is, when I was a child, and Zainab was a child much after me, I'm sure, she will attest to it, the religion, the Islam we grew up in was slightly different. I went to Qawwali, which is a form of music, devotional music, which is prevalent in South Asia, as a form of devotion. Now ISIS would behead me for listening to Qawwali. The fact remains that the reason why radical Islamism has become the menace it has become is because during the Cold War, a critical error was made by the greatest superpower at that time, the United States, which decided, under the influence of its allies in the Middle East, that Islamic fundamentalism could actually be a means of fighting communism. And it worked. It worked. Most of the Muslim world didn't become communist as a result. And now that radicalism is, of course, has grown into a menace, global menace. Yesterday, David Cameron made a very good speech, by the way. I commend it to everyone in this room. I'm not in the business of commending politicians, even though I worked for many of them in my own life. But David Cameron's speech yesterday about what Britain plans to do about Islamist extremism is the speech I would like to hear from the United States president. And here is a very short summary of it. He basically said we have to recognize that if Islamist extremists self-identify themselves as Muslims, then we can get out of the business of saying, oh, this has nothing to do with Islam. Because it does. It may be a variant, it may be a distortion, it may be an extreme view, but it does have to do with Islam. And we Muslims need to recognize it above all. Second, it's a radical ideology. And all ideologies, when they are fought, need an ideological counter-narrative or strategy. The United States did very well during the Cold War in fighting communism. You had an ideological counter-narrative. You created institutions globally that denigrated the communist ideology and argued against it. Here in the US, it's been the journal whose name you cannot remember, Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, was my idea, and my friend Hillel Fratkin and Eric Brown, we got together, we started it. It's the only journal in the English language that studies various radical texts and tries to explain them in plain English. Ideally, this should be a bit similar to the journal that was published during the Cold War and still gets published, called Problems of Communism, which was published in hundreds of languages, no, not hundreds, but dozens of languages. Now, I'm kind of getting into the Trump moment of exaggerating too much. Dozens of languages is more accurate than hundreds. And so people actually understand what is being discussed by these ideologues. For example, 3 or 4 years ago, we read some articles and magazines online, and we realized that a new movement was arising, which was was going to end up being the Islamic State. So, what will be the components of a policy response? 4. One, of course, there will be a military component. You'll have to fight the extremists who are armed and controlling territory. That's how you dislodge people from territory. So there has to be a military component. There has to be an intelligence component to understand what's going on within these movements. There has to be an ideological component. And then there has to be a law enforcement component for finding and identifying and acting against those who are actually breaking various laws. But the ideological component is what is totally missing. You cannot let people who kind of, I mean, just to give you an example, Danielle, and then I'll give the I'll go quiet for a few minutes so others can speak. There is a tendency in the State Department to make sure that when they are having an iftar or anything, there is X number of women in hijab and X number of men with beards, because that's their stereotype of Muslim. Now, if you're having a meeting of American Jewish leaders, you will invite whoever is important in the Jewish community. You won't just invite rabbis. And the Muslims, there are women, and I respect them very much. There are women in my family who cover their head, wear the hijab. There are women who wear a looser hijab, and then there are women who don't wear the hijab, but they're all Muslims. And Islam, with all its diversity, has to be recognized, and the real role of the Western power should be to encourage diversity, because what's happening in the Muslim world is that voices of diversity are being crushed. For example, Sayyid Qutb may have, everybody familiar with the name Sayyid Qutb, Muslim Brotherhood leader, in many ways the originator of a kind of a modern terrorist ideology, but he's not the originator, because there are other movements in Islamic history in 14th centuries that have been similarly extremist. But there's also another Egyptian scholar, Ali Abdel Razik. I doubt if anybody except 2 or 3 of us have heard about him. He actually wrote a book making the argument why this whole notion of an Islamic state is flawed, because Medina was not really a state in the modern sense, and therefore the purpose of Islam is piety and not power. And that book, I mean, if I were, say, for example, running the ideological campaign based on something similar to the Congress for Cultural Freedom Against Communism, I'd make sure there were millions of copies of this book in Arabic and Persian and Urdu and Uzbek and Bahasa Indonesia, and people actually read the theological argument for why the notion of the Islamic State in the modern era is a flawed notion. I'll stop here. Let others speak.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at your first question. Really, it's 2 components, and in terms of what we do about it, we got to be careful about who are we. There's certainly a role for us as a nation, as America, to play in this fight. Instead of a war on Islam, I think what we're seeing now, to a great degree, unfortunately, is a war within Islam. Some of it is ideological, some of it is military. Some of those military attempts are very much legitimate, objective. A lot of them, unfortunately, in the past couple of years, at least in the Middle East, have been completely diverted for other political purposes. As the United States, we need to be cognizant of that. We need to make sure that our position is really one in which creates an environment for a diversity of opinions to actually see the light of day. So kind of going back, there's 2 things. Philosophically, we need to increase, not we America, but we people who want to see this problem more effectively addressed, we need to increase the jurisprudential literacy of the masses. I'm not somebody who believes, and part of this is based on our polling, which I will share with you in a minute. I'm not somebody who believes we need more scholars that can counter extremist narratives. There are a lot of those people. They're very highly qualified. I can list pages and pages of names on a piece of paper for somebody. They've been very active in this space. They're doing everything they can, quite frankly. The challenge really is in having somebody not believe that joining the Muslim Brotherhood will send them to heaven, because the Qur'an actually doesn't say that joining the Muslim Brotherhood will send you to heaven. How does that? I mean, nothing does, other than the murshid of the Ikhwan, quite frankly. And I say this, and we need to be clear. And that's the challenge, because those people have been convinced, primarily because of a state of jurisprudential illiteracy, that this has become required, that what is fiqh has become sharia. Therefore, the person... So the first panel talked a lot about sharia and fiqh. I know this is going to trigger a lot of concern with some people, because this point is often used, I think, very disingenuously to avoid the issue of the whole question of reforming Islam. But Sharia, and we will debate this, I'm sure many people in the room disagree, Sharia, from my view, is the utopian ideal set in the Qur'an as a flag to rally towards, as a goal to achieve in a utopian existence. Fiqh is the attempt by human beings who make mistakes, who are mostly lawyers, in trying to interpret out from that utopian ideal, how do we do it on planet Earth? A very important point was made in the last panel, which is this idea that ISIS is not a traditionalist movement. ISIS is actually a complete derivation or walking away from the traditions of jurisprudence within Islam. The schools of thought that were very eloquently explained by the last panel, the very premise of what they did was legal debate. And as a lawyer, everyone knows that any real lawyer knows that the answer, no matter what, is it depends, ... If you, and this is just kind of a litmus test for people that don't want to become experts on Islam. And I wouldn't call myself one, but I'm definitely familiar enough to kind of talk on this a little. If you're facing a movement whose ideology is essentially, if you don't agree with me, you lack moral credibility as a Muslim, you are a kafir, you are a fasiq, you are XXX, you are not dealing with somebody who operates in the traditional approach to jurisprudence in Islam, because that tradition is foundationally based on the idea that Abbas and I can disagree, but fundamentally, our disagreement doesn't necessitate for one of us to be less of a Muslim. Or our debate or disagreement doesn't necessitate for one of us to not go to heaven and the other one to go to heaven. The confusion between fiqh and sharia has created an environment in which people who are claiming to be scholars, and maybe some of them are, actually assume the title of holy man. And I'll talk a little bit about the Sunni perspective now. In Sunni traditional Islam, the only thing that's holy is God. Your sheikh, the prophet himself, these people were not considered to be holy. The Kaaba is not holy. The Qur'an is not holy. God is holy. And the word of God is believed to be, as Shadi very eloquently and very accurately described, to be the actual spoken word of God. When you begin to see fiqh as sharia and have that confusion, you begin to enter a space where the religious leader is now assuming a holy role that is completely alien to traditional Islam, and based on that, what this person says is religiously mandated. If this person stands on a square in Rab al-Adawiyah in Cairo and says, "Who wants to die a martyr, raise your hand," if I'm a good Muslim, I need to be in that square, I need to raise my hand. If this person says, to be a good Muslim, you have to do X, Y, and Z, it's automatically, it's either that or not. The reason I focus on this idea of of increasing the jurisprudential literacy in the masses is because when we polled on all of these issues very thoroughly between 2005 to 2009, what was initially a study of 35 Muslim majority countries then became 40 plus Muslim majority countries. When we asked people about 9/11, do you think it's completely justified or unjustified? Most people in this room will not be surprised. Overwhelming majorities said that it was completely unjustified. Closer to 9/11, I think that would have been a surprising finding to some audiences. But I think all of us now have reached at least a little bit of understanding of what we're dealing with here, and understanding that the average Muslim on the street is definitely not going to commit their life to committing 9/11. The few that did, when we asked them why it was justified in an open-ended format, and this is across 40 countries, not one response included a religious justification. All of them included political justifications, basically grievances that people have with the West. When we dug a little bit deeper to understand, well, what are the sources of those grievances with the West, we basically found three pockets of attitudes, or three general topics that people continuously cited. This is irrespective of language, culture, level of education, urban, rural, male, female, the whole 9 yards. It was political hegemony in that the US and the West generally do not want to see these people, Muslims in Muslim majority country, attain a level of self-determination. They don't support us governing ourselves the way we want. They don't even support democracy in our country. These are overwhelming majorities in almost every single country. So political hegemony, acute conflicts, I'm upset about Palestine, I'm upset about the Iraq war, et cetera, and religious and cultural disrespect. The notion that Islam is willy-nilly disrespected, not seen as serious, not taken as equal by people in the West. So when you ask people in Muslim majority countries, what do you admire most about the West? Open-ended question. The most common answers will surprise you. Number one is technology. Number two is liberty. Interesting. When you ask Americans what they think about Islam or the positive impressions they have about Islam, there's basically nothing. So to some degree, Muslims are not crazy. They actually realize that a major part of the disconnect in the communication across, waters is essentially that we as Muslims, based on the polling, have a lot of admiration for the West, but we also have a lot of issues with the West. But the West sort of sees us as a problem. And and I'm not saying this is the truth, I'm saying this is perception. But in my business, perception drives reality, and it drives behavior.
Okay, so my only point is that Muslim leaders need to lead instead of following perceptions. These perceptions have been created by our leaders, including thought leaders. Fewer books have been translated into the Arabic language, which is the language of 300 million people in the last century, than are translated into Spanish every year. Pakistan, which is a nation of 200 million, published only 2,583 books the year before last, compared to, say, for example, 10,000 for Finland, which has a population of 5 million. Actually, it is time for Muslims to recognize their decline and the causes of it. And that is not going to happen by increasing jurisprudential awareness, with all due respect. I understand that most Muslims, actually, many people who fight, for example, the Taliban, many of them don't know much about Islam. They really don't. They are fighting for Islam, and they don't know much about Islam. They just are following a leader. They say, this mullah is the man who knows Islam. I'm following him. I'm trying to go to heaven. But I think the real role, and that jurisprudential awareness, increasing that is the job of Muslims.
Absolutely. I'm talking about the jurisprudential literacy of Muslim citizens. However, I think you just made my point. If you're a Taliban fighter that knows nothing about Islam, and you're believing your Taliban commander...
But the policy question that Danielle asked, if I may complete my thought, the policy question does not actually have anything to do with the jurisprudential awareness, although it should, but it cannot. For the simple reason that that's not what policies of government can be about. They can be about the manifestations. They cannot be about a deep-rooted psychosis.
Absolutely. I'm not proposing that the Department of Defense embark on a jurisprudential literacy program.
Also, separation between politics and religion, it's a big, big factor. Respecting rule of law. Also respecting human rights in these countries. And I strongly believe that the majority of our problems in the Muslim world comes from the lack of human rights, the lack of respecting rule of law and justice. We're not free to speak, we're not free to demonstrate, we're not free to practice our religion. Mm-hmm. You come to America, you come to the West to be able to practice your religion freely without being persecuted by these so-called Islamic governments or Muslim governments. These governments are the base of radicalism and extremism that we are facing and seeing today on the rise, and they are supporting it. So they are supporting it financially. They are supporting it also with text and books and education throughout their satellite TVs, throughout their curriculums that they teach in schools and so on and so forth.
Can I? Well, I actually think we have more agreement on the panel than you would otherwise be led to believe from them jumping on each other. But
we don't jump on each other. We just debate in the Islamic tradition of
you took the words out of my
theological debate.
That's right, in the tradition of tolerance. But I actually think that you're all saying the same thing, which is that fundamentally there is a leadership problem that we perceive that is coming from this part of the world, that the people who others look to, whether they're self-designated or they're actually acknowledged by the United States government and the State Department, are in fact pushing people. They are first of all leading these perceptions, and I think that's very important. I think that the point you made is exactly right, which is that these perceptions don't come from nowhere. The challenge here, though, I think, is how you operationalize any of these understandings. And this is where I really wanted to press on what you said, Husain. It's become extremely popular to analogize the ideological battle. The president, for the first time, I think, said that this is an ideological fight. You don't win ideological fights with bullets. Well, you know, some part of it, I think you do win with bullets. But in fact, but that being said, the challenge is that this really isn't like communism in so many ways. First of all, this was an all-out battle against an ideology which we sought to defeat. Okay, now it's going to be very uncomfortable to suggest that we want to defeat, Islamism, at least in the nuanced way that it requires. But in addition, it is much more fraught for a government of the nature of the American, or frankly our European allies, to take on an ideological question that relates to religion. Okay, because all of a sudden we're not going to start publishing magazines like Encounter. I mean, I hate to say it, but there isn't a government in the world, right, left, Democrat, Republican, that has the guts to do that kind of thing. Ditto.
Too bad.
Well,
I would argue that that's actually extremely counterproductive. I mean, the last thing, look, and I say this, I really don't want to sound flippant, but if we're going to substitute Operation Iraqi Freedom with Operation Iraqi Salvation, it's not a good plan. The U.S. government has no business, this is to speak in policy, what we should do as U.S., we have no business involving ourselves in things we're not experts on. We're not experts on reforming religion. We didn't do that in this country as the government. We shouldn't be doing that in other places. Something that Zainab talked about is really crucial. This idea of we can't reform Islam as the U.S. government, but we certainly are experts on addressing the ecosystem in which these kinds of movements can find followers, supporters, people to fund, et cetera, et cetera. What are those? They're different in every country. A lot of the reality that you described is really more of a reality of, let's be honest, the Persian Gulf. In North Africa, governments are not promoting an ideology that supports jihadism, if you will. They're actually trying to do the opposite, but in a very counterproductive way, because they've also done the same thing. They have state-funded, state-mandated religion. So whether that is a Wahhabi, minded royal family somewhere, whether it is a Shia regime somewhere, whether it's a military dictatorship somewhere in the Middle East, it's a bad idea. It's not sustainable, and it's not going to work. So we shouldn't be, as the U.S. government, we shouldn't be a part of that process. That's something those countries need to figure out on their own.
I think we can, as the United States, can help in that. There are millions of dollars that have been spent every single year on programs to nourish the civil society, which we called for reform. And I remember many years ago in the 90s, 96, 97, on to the Arab Spring, a lot of effort has been put into democracy education in the Middle East. And I think the Arab Spring was a result of that.
Okay, but wait a minute, wait, stop. But critics will say, you know how I feel about this.
How did that turn
out? Right. Critics will say, how did that turn out? And,
that's right.
And doesn't movement toward democracy advantage the very Islamists who then come to power? And we should talk about Egypt.
Absolutely.
Well, not just that. It also created an environment where where these people were basically suspect because they are now Of course, I do too. Absolutely.
We need that.
And the Qur'an does. Go ahead.
I don't disagree with you in terms of how it turns out, but I'm talking about the mechanism that's been used. And I think we could use the same exact thing to make that reform or to help the population in these countries to make that kind of reform. And I think dictatorship, oppression, lack of human rights, it has a major effect on what we are seeing these days. And of course, giving the liberty to all of these religious political leaders to interpret or to display Islam the way they wish to serve their own political agenda, that's a big harm, not only for the societies and for the Muslim community or Muslim countries, but also for the worldwide nations. They are suffering from this thing.
Yeah, I definitely, we agree more than we disagree. What I'm trying to say is, as policy making, let's focus on what we're experts on. From my perspective, this is what we're experts on here in the U.S. Jobs, trade, inclusion of young people outside of the classroom, engaging young people in contexts where they can develop their skills in ways that go beyond what next job are you going to find, believing in developing in people as a human resource. Those are all things that definitely touch on what you talked about. They have nothing to do with reforming Islam. And in our public opinion research are things that the number one thing that Muslim majority countries say, this is what would improve our condition, it's what would improve our relationship with the West, jobs and commerce.
Well, I have one point to tell you here. I don't disagree on that, but also you can see that a lot of young people who are joining ISIS these days coming from high-class family, well-educated, and so on. So how is that related to what you are?
That's so important. I'm sorry, and then I'll go ahead. That's such an important question. Because you put your finger right on it, because that's a source of the confusion. Poverty creates terrorism. Well, not everywhere. Mohamed Atta wasn't impoverished. That's true, but a lot of the people that are joining the Hashd Shabi and I just was watching Dal Arabiya video of people being tortured to death. A lot of those people are probably not super wealthy, and they're probably not from elite Ivy League schools. The issue is there's an underlying narrative, I'm coming to you right now, there's an underlying narrative of those grievances that people tap into. Some of those actors are Mohamed Atta's. Some of those actors are the kid down the street that's going to do something crazy in Fallujah. That all is part of the problem. Our challenge is, instead of creating a poster child of this is the problem, we need to be more nuanced in our approach, take a more localized look, and see what is causing this group of people to join, what is causing that group of people to join, and I think the solutions are different in different places.
With all due respect to both my Arab colleagues, the non-Arab, the Ajami Muslim here, who now we actually are the greater part of the Muslim world. And yes, exactly. And so we need to be heard as well. You have your set of problems and your issues. We actually have a working democracy in Indonesia. We have a working democracy in Malaysia. The biggest number of Muslims living in a democracy are in India. They're not producing terrorists. Why is it? Here's the reason. In India, a Muslim dissident, a Muslim scholar who has a new outlook on theology and jurisprudence, who says, I don't believe in Bukhari for the following reasons, I have this argument or that, he cannot be eliminated easily, he cannot be shut down, he appears on some television channel or another, his books are published, his articles are published, his voice is heard, he can give a sermon in a mosque. In most of the Middle East, it cannot happen for one reason or another. Either the state won't let him do it, or the mob will not let him do it. And that is the real difference. So when I said that there is a role for Western powers, and I cited David Cameron, look, this argument that, what America really does good is give jobs and provide university education, etc., actually is something, if you go back a little in time, the Muslim Brotherhood took tremendous advantage of. It came here in the 60s and 70s, created Muslim students associations in universities, the International Islamic Federation of Student Organizations, printed thousands of copies of books by Qutb and Maududi, which were available in every mosque on campuses, and actually radicalized people more by taking advantage of this openness, and that's why you have all these people here, a lot of them. My argument is slightly different. I think that what the Western governments can do, and not only governments, but foundations, individuals, think tanks can do, is actually to give a voice to the voices in the Muslim world that are being shut up. People who can't be heard there. If Taha had been able to escape Sudan and be in the United States, he could have written, he could have spoken, he could have given speeches on television, etc., recorded in modern times, YouTube messages. He wouldn't have been executed. So that's one role, policy role, one concrete idea is to protect and provide an opportunity to those voices of Muslim pluralism that are being shut up within the Muslim world. Second, the real radicalization comes from three factors. You call them grievances, I call them partly grievances and partly conspiracy theories. And the governments sometimes encourage them. I mean, Egypt is one example where the government doesn't mind. During Mubarak's time, I remember, they had that famous television show about the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And, that actually is, it makes people feel, oh God, everything that... For example, if the Muslims feel that what is good about the West is its technology and its liberty, we should be trying to get ahead in technology and ahead in liberty instead of just trying to drag the West down, which is what the Islamist idea is. All the Islamist texts I've read have not said the Muslims should be, and this means I've read Qutb, by the way, as a child. I was part of the Islamic movement in Pakistan. All the young books, all the books that they have, that the young people read, they are making an argument that the West actually corrupts morals, that the West is controlled by the Jews. It's not about, they are superior in technology, now we need to advance in technology and take over. It's not about, they have more liberty, let's enhance our levels of liberty to get there. So this is like an unconnected argument. I mean, I accept the argument that that's how people perceive, but their perception is internally flawed. And so the three things that should be a priority for Western governments is to fight the conspiracy theories, to oppose the anti-Semitism that is deeply rooted, and to also now fight sectarianism and tell and encourage Muslims, say, you know what, you want our kind of lifestyles? It's not that we'll give you jobs if you come here. You can build that prosperity there by having the liberty and by having the diversity and by respecting. For example, if you're a Sunni and you believe Shias are going to hell, let them go to hell on their own. Don't make the effort of killing them to get there quicker. And if you're a Shia, I mean, what is the Sunni Shia fight? Let's be honest about it. It's a disagreement that goes back into history about the succession to Prophet Muhammad. What relevance does it have in the 21st century? Let the Shias be Shias and let the Sunnis be Sunnis. Okay, so, I don't know, but I have a feeling Younis believes that Abu Bakr was the rightful caliph to Prophet Muhammad. Zainab might believe that Ali should have been the legitimate successor. We can disagree on that and still sit on the same panel, live in the same society, and acquire the technology and build the institutions of liberty that we need. That argument is not sufficiently being made in the Muslim world, partly because the entire structure of state, of government, of politics does not allow people to make that argument. And I think the West does have a role to play.
I think there's obviously a lot to discuss here, and I know that there's actually a lot of disagreement about the issue of the legitimacy of the kind of grievances that you hear about, which tend to, but in the interest of advancing the conversation and really thinking about policy options. So, if we agree that a lot of the problem centers around systems of government, rule of law, leadership, then and we agree that in fact the United States and Western governments actually do have a role to play here. No, it's not, it's not as this administration appears to believe, as Sarah Palin appears to believe, a fight that should go on in the region where everybody kills each other and let God sort it out. But that in fact we have a constructive role to play and we have an interest, and I think we agree about that. Then the question becomes, okay, how? So there are two examples here that I think are of interest to everybody. One is the government set, and we do a disservice by not talking about Shia extremism. Ayatollah Khomeini didn't come out because of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
Agree.
Right. So we have the Shia extremism, which is spreading, and now we have the problem in, obviously in Syria, but also in Yemen and Bahrain and elsewhere. And then we have the Wahhabi extremism, the heart of which has come always from Riyadh. So we have these two. But then on the other side, we have many who are suggesting we need to embrace somebody like Sisi, the new Mubarak, All right, then you went better. Not much better. And I'm not sure how that works, and I'd really like to hear your impressions about whether these are the right approaches.
Well, I will definitely address that, but I just want to make clear that I'm not proposing that all Muslims who believe in diversity come hide in the U.S. and publish their books here. I was actually proposing that we support that kind of environment being created. So I think we're actually saying the same thing. On the issue of whether or not we should support a particular leader in Sisi or not Sisi, I think that a lot of the Sisi focus now is really about a coincidence. It just happens to be that you have a new president in Egypt who has been consolidating power, and he is focused on creating a counter-narrative to all hues of Islamists, and they're not all the same. And definitely, there's a huge distinction between civilians who are trying to pursue a civilian approach and people who are essentially terrorists. That's Egypt's beef. For the U.S. to go in and sort of give Sisi added support is going to do two things. One thing, whether you like what he's doing or not, it completely delegitimizes what he's trying to accomplish. I very highly doubt that Sisi wants U.S. policymakers to say, look at Sisi, he's awesome. This is how we're going to fix Islam. And I'm not somebody that's, clearly you can tell from my previous comments, state-sanctioned religion, I don't think that's a sustainable option. And I think actually the traditional history of Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic states, etc., have proven that that's not a sustainable option, because when power has tried to co-opt that process, the process loses credibility and the power makes really bad decisions. That's just been consistently the case. So what we should do is focus more on the ecosystem. What are the things that push people in Egypt to reach a conclusion that I want to join the Muslim Brotherhood to go to heaven? Well, I'll tell you, in their neighborhood, for most of their lives, if they are, anywhere 50 or younger, the only people that were showing up in their neighborhood to address their underlying issues, whether they are social, economic, political, etc., is that movement. So unless you start addressing those issues and focus on the fact that the average Muslim needs to understand that they don't need to join the Muslim Brotherhood to go to heaven, because the Qur'an doesn't teach that they need to join the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, that's not Islam. That's a complete fabrication.
You've got two mixed things here. One is that we're supposed to be telling them that they don't need to join the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other is that we're supposed to be addressing their...
No. So we don't need... So the jurisprudential illiteracy question needs to be addressed by Muslims based on their terms in their societies. If we can notice people that are speaking out against that, that's great. For us to advocate them completely cuts their knees out from under them. That's one issue. We shouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. The other issue is the underlying ecosystem.
But there is no freedom even to discuss that issue among Muslims.
My argument is that there will be less freedom as soon as the State Department starts ear-tagging money to support Islam al-Bahiri in Egypt is a great example. He actually took on Ibn Taymiyyah, and we saw what happened because of it. Imagine if Islam al-Bahiri actually was funded by an NGO here in Washington. Actually, a lot of the allegations against him, and Shadi, correct me if I'm wrong, was that was exactly the case.
Which is why it's so important to transform the whole environment in which conspiracy theories thrive.
Okay, how? How?
I'll come to that in a second, but let me set something right on the historic explanation. The truth is that in Islamic history, the ruler's way of approaching religion has almost always prevailed. It was Al-Mamun and his inquisition that ended up finishing off the Mu'tazila. It was the fact that the Ottomans were Hanafi that made vast tracts of Islam, of the Muslim world. And no, you're not, because the way we are understanding it is that state-sanctioned religion is what ended up prevailing everywhere. For example, it's Saudi Arabia and its embrace of Wahhabism.
So my argument is let's not support more state-sanctioned religion.
Hold on. First, let's get the history right. You say that in Islamic history, state sanction has not led. My argument is that state sanction is what has actually created the domination of a certain point.
You're misunderstanding my argument. My argument is not that. My argument is state-sanctioned religion produces unadmirable outcomes.
Okay, so
we should not support state sanctions. That's clear.
That's a different thing than saying that in Islamic history, state-sanctioned religion hasn't prevailed.
No, I didn't say it hasn't prevailed. I said it has consistently produced problematic outcomes.
Now, my argument would be that the real problem in the Muslim world comes from a narrative that is rooted in a total misunderstanding of the rise and fall or rise and decline of Islam. It's a ahistoric argument. If you read fundamentalist literature, a lot of it is actually a very sort of parsed explanation of why we are where we are, oversimplifications, such as, for example, those you find in Milestones. And this oversimplification that a young man feels that Islam is under threat or Islam is in danger, and therefore I need to do something to protect it. So that the space for making the counter argument cannot come in the present environment, at least in the Middle East. In Indonesia, you can have multiple voices. In India, you can have multiple voices. In Bangladesh, occasionally a person will get stabbed for his views, but the state will be trying to protect the people who have diverse views. In the Middle East, it's not the case. In the Middle East, it's state-sanctioned, which is can be Sisi version or it can be the Saudi version. And then there is all these movements. Counter movements to these can flourish only if they have. The legitimacy question is a good question. You raise a very good point that in the present environment, anybody who has support from outside will not have legitimacy. I have 100% agreement with you on that one. But that said, I think that in terms of allowing the pluralist ideas to cross-pollinate, say for example, Abdurrahman Wahid's views from Indonesia appearing in the Middle East, and actually Middle Easterners for once taking a deep breath and saying, you know what, we are not the only Muslims in the world. Just because we were born into the Arabic language does not make us superior. And therefore, there are other voices on Islam. It's not just Al-Azhar. There are more modern Islamic seminaries that exist in the non-Arabic world, and we need to start hearing their voices. And there, if facilitation can be provided, and I'm not talking about the State Department or any US government branch doing that, because the US government generally tends to do things inefficiently and incompetently. We are talking about policy options for the US, which means a broad range of options, a broad range of actors. I think that delegitimizing and countering the narrative of anti-Semitism, the narrative of conspiracy theories, and the narrative of sectarianism, and the distorted explanation of Muslim history. We were great until the colonialists came. Not true. The fact is, we did not become weak because we were colonized. We were colonized because we were weak. The Muslim world's decline has to be understood by Muslims. And there, I think, there is a role for American academia. There is a role for American non-governmental organizations. There's a role for foundations. There's a role for think tanks. And if the government can facilitate any of that, there's a role for government. That's what I think.
I want to turn to the audience, but I want Zainab to just have a chance to expand on what you were alluding to. You know, again, you were talking about the fact that while there may be plenty of opposing voices to the challenges that we face, we're really not capable. Okay, so we need to invest in rule of law. We need to invest in
human
education,
rights,
in human rights. But how do we do that without falling into the same trap that we've fallen into so many times?
We need to diversify the voices. And by diversifying, we're not listening to only one group, and this group, they claim that they represent Muslims and all Muslims. And this is what we are missing. And we see the best example of it here in the US, and this is also reflecting overseas in the Muslim world.
What do you mean, be specific?
Certain organization or people who claim that they are speaking on behalf of the Muslim community in the whole United States. Certainly, they don't represent majority of the Muslim voices in America, and our government here listen to them as they are the legitimate, they are the representative of the Muslims in all over the United States, and this is certainly not true. There are many different options that we need to take into consideration and we need to tackle. we need to tackle the issue of extremism and radicalism from many different directions. If it's through grassroots, then it would be one option. The second one, if we need to use military option to overcome the radical extremist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and many other people, then this is another option that we need to eliminate that, because we cannot be always the victims in paying people's lives as a token to their ideology. And this is showing us as a weak country not being able to take a strong stand against all of these radical groups. And unfortunately, I think Muslims are now realizing that these groups are their first enemies, and the U.S. is watching. And the conspiracy theory again, and I agree with Husain here. It's looming around that, because they said, well, America is now supporting all of these radical groups by just watching and not taking any strong action to overcome this problem.
Let's open it up to questions. I'm sorry, there's so much to talk about. Please, I'll call on you. You know what the drill is. Wait for the mic, identify yourself, put your brilliant statement in the form of a question. Young man back here, right next to the mic.
Thank you. Gerard Robinson with AEI. Been involved with school choice for 20 years, particularly school vouchers. In the 1990s, those who were against school vouchers said we shouldn't publicly fund KKK schools. After 9/11, they said we shouldn't use publicly funded schools money to fund religious radical Islamic schools. My question is, with the current growth in publicly supported scholarships to include vouchers, tax credits, and education savings account, what recommendations do you have for us to broaden the discussion about how Muslim schools can be a part of the solution of educating American students and expanding opportunities for the least those who can afford it?
Which one?
I mean, I'm not an expert on education or voucher schools, but one thing that we haven't mentioned here, I mean, Zainab, you definitely alluded to it to some degree, is the American Muslim community. They are one of the most effective, I think, voices, at least from within the United States, that could address some of these issues. The good news is, both in the polling that we've done at Gallup and many other organizations have done, the good news is that the Muslim American community actually, socioeconomically speaking, educationally speaking, and sort of perception-wise in terms of local issues, current policy issues, they're actually a very successful group of people. The challenge with this successful group of people is another issue that Zainab alluded to, is they don't necessarily have the structures within their community that have been effectively able to sort of bridge from their local experience to the national conversation. Certainly that's not to disparage Muslim American organizations. Many of them are very well-meaning. They're doing the best they can. But the reality of it is that you're dealing with a very, very diverse community. And the 2 or 3 acronym organizations don't effectively, I think, represent all views within that.
The other thing is the problem that we are seeing a lot in the curriculums that we have. Since we have freedom to publish and teach whatever we want, this is a big deal. A few years ago, we looked into some of the curriculums that some of these Islamic schools teaches here, and it's full of anti-Semitism, hatred, and violence. And we're not talking about something happening overseas. We're talking about something happening here in the U.S., and this is a great danger. Also, on the other hand, what we are seeing and noticing in college campuses these days, and it's been, many of the Islamist groups are taking places, and they have their own organizations and clubs on college campuses that actually what they do is encourage Muslims who are native Muslims to become more radicals if they are not, and more extreme. And if they are not Muslim, they encourage them to convert to Islam. But which teaching of Islam, the extreme way of teaching that, and encouraging many young people to even go overseas to join many radical and extremist groups. And this is a problem that we are noticing and seeing. We have a program in college campus called Project Noor to work with young people, Muslim people on college campuses. And these problems that we are detecting in many campuses here, and we're seeing a lot of young people being harassed by these radical groups on campus and not being able to practice their life just like any ordinary American young students.
Yep, over here.
Yvonne Pliss, I'm a reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation. I'm glad we've moved toward Muslims within the West, because we were talking for a while about them as though they're mutually exclusive categories. Prime Minister Cameron, in his speech yesterday, and others have spoken increasingly about being more proactive. I write a lot about radicalization and recruitment, about the ideological component of countering recruitment by extremist groups and so on. I think there's already a consensus, a disagreement on the panel, rather, that it's difficult for government to enter that ideological sphere, especially when it's dealing within its own borders. It's perhaps even more fraught than internationally. So law enforcement certainly has a role to play, but what, in the panel's opinion, is the role of government, the extent of the government's ability to work with its own citizens on the ideological stage?
Zainab, you want to take? Yeah, I think. Look, I think it's different.
How about you?
Yeah, no, he's not a citizen now, so you can't comment.
Please, no talk.
Look, there isn't one answer. You know, there's a lot of debate now about the CVE program, obviously.
Countering violent
extremism. And just for those that aren't familiar, the debate really is you're not being as specific as you can about the fact that it is Muslims who are committing the acts we're trying to stop. On the other side, people are saying, well, only inviting Muslims to a summit that is just blandly called countering violent extremism kind of sends the message that they are focused on Muslims. So I think that debate is actually wholly unhelpful. Because it continues this sort of polemical back and forth about where are the condemnations on one side, which is ludicrous, because if you go to any Muslim organization's website today in 2015, there's nothing but condemnations on it that date back probably a decade. And then on the other side, you know, Muslims are Islamist peace. This has nothing to do with Islam. Leave the Muslims alone. Look, it's different in different places. I would say local more than federal. That's the real issue. How does a kid like the young person we had in Chattanooga who tragically murdered you know, innocent civilians, how does that person create an environment in their society? How do we as a mayor, as a school, as a mosque, as a church, as a synagogue, how do we create an environment where that person has somewhere to go? That person has somebody who knows something about jurisprudential literacy to actually go and test these ideas with, and is not just at night on Twitter figuring it out or dealing with whatever we're going to figure out with this kid, interpersonal issues, and then connecting that to what's happening with ISIS. So local more than federal, and the food fight conversation about Muslims are really terrorists, no, they're really innocent, is extremely unhelpful.
And one quick line from Cameron's speech yesterday. He says, and I quote, "We've got to show that if you say, yes, I condemn terror, but the kuffar, the unbelievers, are inferior, or violence in London isn't justified, but suicide bombs in Israel are a different matter, then you too are part of the problem." And I think that approach certainly needs to be adopted here in the United States as well.
This is what we are seeing. Unfortunately, there are a lot. Beside all of these condemnations that we see on websites and on TV and all of that, the reality that when there is a small group or there is a meeting in a mosque or somewhere else, you see people, you know, all of these does not apply, all of this condemnation. And every time you said, well, we're being here in the U.S., we are discriminated against, we are this, we are that. In fact, as Muslim living in America, we have all the rights and just like any other citizen, practicing and doing whatever we want. But when you hear this in a close conversation, you hear dehumanizing the West, dehumanizing people who are not Muslims, and making them as, you know, because they are not believing in the same religion or the same ideology. Even if they are Muslim and not believing in the same ideology, then they deserve to be killed or to be destroyed or beheaded. This is a problem and an issue that we need to be focusing more on, as is the root of the problem. Also, modern technology now, it become another threat. Social media, recruitment of young people and men and women, that they've been brainwashed by all of these different websites, individuals who are working very hard to recruit people from the West, specifically highly educated, to go and fight alongside with all of these radical groups, such as ISIS in the Middle East or the Muslim world. These are issues that we have not found any solution for yet, nor the government is really paying that close attention to.
No, in fact, they've defunded almost all the efforts that have been going toward going after people who are looking to go to Syria or to Yemen. So it's even worse than simple ignorance. One last word from me, and this is the one thing that I want to sort of leave us with, and I wish I understood our government better in this regard. We embrace certain values. David Cameron, the speech that we keep quoting, talks a lot about liberal values, and that is what our country is founded on. It is the fight that we see every day, not about terrorism, but about women's rights, or about gay rights, or about. And yet, when we look overseas, it is as if those ideas are suspended. Oh, no, we have to be respectful. And the answer is no. With our money, we don't have to be respectful. Actually, with our foreign policy, we don't have to be respectful. These are our values, and we can stand by them. And I've never understood why the Bill of Rights is not our plan for how we manage foreign assistance to other countries, to other groups. It seems to me to be a quite simple diktat. And as usual, as the moderator, I stole the last word. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time for questions, but let me thank our panelists. This conversation is so much bigger than the hour, but they were wonderful. And let me just say a word of thanks also to Katie Earle and to Tara Bini, who did so much work to make this conference happen. I hope the conversation can continue. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for your rant. I was sending an email. I just started last week.
VA officials warned this week that it may have to close some of its hospitals in August